Related question, because this is something that I've been thinking about this, but this is more for me. So would you say that is ethics a subalternated science to politics?
Uh, if anything, I don't think so. But if there was any kind of order of subalternation, it would be politics to ethics.
Yeah. Well, I always thought that was interesting because like Aristotle kind of makes clear in the Ethics that what he's doing is political philosophy, right?
Is what?
That what he's doing in the Ethics is political philosophy.
So what? Yeah, the reason. So the reason I said well, I think he says specifically that what he's doing is ordered to political philosophy.
Let's see. Well, yeah, okay. Let's see. I haven't looked at it that line in particular, but okay. Even still, right? It seems that I don't know. It seems like what he's doing is some part of political philosophy. Even if it's ordered to political philosophy, it can't be subaltern to that which it is ordered to, can it?
Well, the reason, like,
Or
what makes a science subalternate to another is this, right? That the conclusions of the
hmm,
higher
there it is.
science are assumed as principles in the subalternate
Yeah,
science, right?
that's what makes it. Yeah, that's.
That's what specifically makes it subalternate, right?
Mhm.
So I don't prove the interior angles theorem in astronomy. I use it,
Yep.
whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not real, but
Yeah, I
I
know what you're
use it
talking about.
if I were to use it in a proof. I assume
It's
it
yeah,
in my demonstrations on the heavenly bodies, right? That's
something like that.
that's
Yeah.
what's happening. The same sort of thing I think is happening with politics and um, ethics, right? I don't prove the supremacy of justice uh, in politics as like the highest virtue. I assume it, right? It seems to me politics is assuming some of the conclusions that ethics
Mm-hmm.
gets to in its own way, right? Now that doesn't mean that politics isn't more noble. I think it is more noble, um,
Mm-hmm. Yes,
but
this is at
the
the end of
less
chapter
the
2 of.
less noble can be the feeding the
Mm-hmm.
mouth of the river that feeds into the greater whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, ethics is just about kind of perfecting one individual, right?
Yeah.
It's about your own perfection, right? But the subject of politics isn't particular perfection, but communal perfection, right? It's about
Mm-hmm.
perfecting the will of the whole community,
Yeah.
um, and that's obviously more noble and more perfect than just dealing with individual perfection, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do that, you have to, because like every science, right, the natural road is to move from the more known to us to the more known
Yeah.
by nature.
Yeah.
You're going to be drawing on those things which are more known, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the individual perfection is more known to us than the communal one, right? So you so like the example of justice, I think, is indicative. Like you do have to um, assume certain things when you do politics uh, that you actually more in detail prove in ethics, right? Like the primacy of justice among
Mm-hmm.
the virtues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you spend a lot more time kind of making that argument in ethics, which is it's just the assumption of politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Justice has a primacy of place um, because communities are founded on justice, right? That's one of the hallmarks of the books on friendship, right? Like, um, if possible, people leaders of communities would see to it that their citizens were not only just but friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's impossible. But in order to have any functioning community, you need to have uh, the members of that community, the citizens, at least be just towards each other. which is a sign of its primacy, right, among the virtues, right?
Yeah.
Because while it's good to perfect just yourself, it's better to perfect yourself
Okay.
in relation to another, right?
Hmm.
So the virtues that deal with perfecting yourself in relation to another are better, therefore, and that's what justice is, right?
Hmm.
It might be true that you benefit from my temperance, but that's only in a secondary way, right? But you benefit from my justice in a very direct way, right?
Hmm.
So that's that's argued um, kind of more explicitly in ethics, right? But that's assumed
Interesting. Yeah.
from in politics,
Hmm.
right? So, um, I mean, and you do see that relationship of nobility with the other subalternate sciences too. Like, it's actually the case that the subalternate sciences are more noble than the sciences that they draw their principles from, right? For example, um, to study to study uh, quantities is noble, but to study quantities in reference to the heavens and their motions is more noble, right?
Hmm.
Like
That's interesting.
I can think about circles, and that's great, and that's perfective of the human mind, sure. But if the circles that I'm considering, or rather the spheres that I'm considering, are the heavens,
Hmm.
that is way better.
Hmm.
It's way better to think about that than just sphere A, B, C. You know, if the sphere I'm considering is the sun and its motion, it's like that's
Hmm.
way better. You know,
Yeah.
it's more noble to think about those things, right? Um, but but in order to think about those things, I have to draw on the science that considers sphere ABC,
Hmm.
right? Um, and the conclusions that are demonstrated about sphere ABC are required in order to do, are required and assumed um, about sphere sun, right? But sphere sun is better to think about than sphere ABC, right? So
Well, I guess that makes sense then of that later division. Now, I guess I understand it now of the general ethics and particular ethics, and they include politics. Or well, politics would be. I don't know. There was something that just didn't make sense to me about. There was a later division of like the general ethics, particular ethics, and maybe it was particular ethics. Well, particular ethics would be particular ethics. General ethics would be politics.
well, I think where are you getting that division from?
Give me a second. I'm gonna have to go searching to pull that up. I know. Let's see. How far back can I go to? Not this. This. Yeah. I don't know if this is the first place I've seen it as far back. I don't know how far back the division goes. There was this book, this Catholic political philosopher Charles Davis, 19. Actually, this is the third edition was published in 1911. Earlier editions were published the late 1800s, dividing general ethics from particular ethics. General ethics deal all right. So dealing with human actions in particular departments, and then he divides particular ethics into economics and politics, which is based on the individual and the household.
Mm,
And that seems to be a pretty common division then across other like late modern Catholic writers.
yeah, yeah. So particular ethics would be ethics specific, Nicomachean ethics, right?
Yeah.
And general ethics, it sounds like, would encompass that as a higher genus and
Hmm.
embrace politics too.
Yeah.
So
He divides general ethics from particular ethics, dealing with human actions in particular. So yeah, general ethics just deals with human action. I generally speaking, I don't know what that would. I don't know what I don't know what science that relates to. And then you have particular ethics. Um, but particular ethics is broken into economic science and political science based on the individual and household. It's page 1. It's the first thing he talks about.
okay, yeah. I mean,
Uh,
I'm not familiar with that division
yeah,
in
and I've seen it in some
a
other places,
traditional
but this
way.
was just one of the back last things that Osborne had sent along to me, but I don't. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that division. I don't know what
Mhm.
general ethics is, and then you want to talk about particular. I don't like. It doesn't make sense to me that you would call politics, which deals with the whole city, particular ethics.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense to me, but
Yeah.
something I'd have to go look more into.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's at the end of in the Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 2, the very end, when he's talking about the end of our inquiry, talking about what we have to look for, and he's talking about we have to figure out what the good is.
Right.
These are the ends at which our inquiry aims, since it is political science, in one sense of that term.
Mhm.
Right? So it just, I don't know, I've always just read that part. Like Aristotle seems to think he's doing some part of political philosophy here.
No, I think I mean, I think that's right. So individual ethics, right? You're talking about just the perfection of the individual, the like,
Mm-hmm.
individual will, right? Um, what is the good of the individual will? Well, according to the ethics, it's what? It's contemplation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that seems like it's pretty I mean, by definition, it's a self-sufficient activity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's it doesn't seem like for me to contemplate there's much community involvement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what also needs to be considered uh, by Aristotle is the inadequacy of contemplation for man, right? This it's the most divine like thing, right? To do this activity. If you contemplate, you're doing what God is doing most of all, right?
Yeah.
But you're not God. You're actually a man, and it's not sufficient for you to just contemplate. It's the
Mm-hmm.
most self-sufficient thing, but it's not self-sufficient absolutely, right? You're a man, and you have to attend to your body, and your body and like that part of you requires certain things, um, and part of that is living in a community, and which means the good of man also involves the perfection of him in reference to not just himself in his own virtue, but virtue in reference to another, which
Mm-hmm.
means the human good in a wider sense involves the common good, which is political. And that's why the politics ends, I think, with a reference to the next book, the politics, or sorry, the ethics ends
Yeah.
with a view to the politics, because as wonderful and perfective um, and fulfilling contemplation is, it by itself can't fulfill man on at least on this side, right? You need you need to be happy by way of community because
Mm-hmm.
you are a political animal by definition. So the human good consists not just of contemplation, but also of those virtues which perfect man in relation to another.
Mm-hmm.
So that's yeah, and Aristotle recognizes that and he says, hey, so if you're paying attention, then we're going to need to talk about that thing specifically. But how does man perfect himself in relation to the community, or more importantly, how is a community made perfect? Uh, how do you order the will of a mass of people and not just perfect the will of one individual?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that look like? So that's why politics deals with what it does, because you're talking about things like, okay, we're regimes. Then what are the different kinds of regimes? Because um, that's how you order uh, the will of many, the style of government that they belong to, right? So it's essential to talk about those governments that are intrinsically capable of doing that and those ones which are not, right? So you talk about kingship and you talk about aristocracy and you talk about polity, and then you talk about those things that are not the flip sides of those ones, right? Tyranny and oligarchy and and democracy, lowercase d, right? Um, and because we're talking about the many, right? We're talking about ordering the will of the many now, and talking about man in relation to a whole community. So, but obviously, you can't understand the whole without understanding the part, and the part is, in this case, just the individual man is more known to us. So you have to tend to that first. So that's yeah. I think that's the rationale behind his verbiage in the ethics.
Yeah, I think later I pulled up Thomas's commentary right on that passage. I might take a look at that later. Yeah, this is one of the things I need to do a little bit of work on if I had the time, but it's beneficial for me for my dissertation purposes. But to come back to that, yeah. Well, this is cool. See, this is why I say you need to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying, man. It's just
Joe even said, right, I almost titled that when I uploaded the segment, "If only Jake were here." That's what Joe keeps saying, and it's like, I thought between the three of us, me, Joe, and Julian, I was like, we've got to be at least half as smart as Jake, but it turns out that's not true. So
I'm just more obsessed with logic than you guys. If you were talking about something else that you guys specialize in, then I'd be in the dark and you guys would be figuring it out.
You realize I'm writing my dissertation on political science, right, and economics, and I'm having trouble getting off the ground. So,
well, that's because you're asking about a question about this guy who divides logic in this divides ethics and politics in this totally unfamiliar way. It's like creating a new genus essentially, and like, oh, how do you explain this? Like, well, I explain it as that guy's doing his own thing, and here's how you do. Here's how it's like been divided, and that's what we're all familiar with. So,
yeah,
right, thumbs up, sweet.
I wonder if McCoy says anything about that kind of division. I might have to go through him.
I can send you
and take a look at that division.
I'll send you.
Like it seems to be a pretty common accepted division of general and particular ethics, but no, but even the going through, like I mentioned to you a couple weeks ago, I was still thinking about that problem in Aristotle of use value versus exchange value. Now, at least in the Aristotelian scholarship, they're like, this is just this is an irreducible problem that it seems, and they're like, even Aristotle recognizes you just can't conflate these at all because quantity and quality, what they reduce use value to quality, exchange value to quantity. And those two things are just irreducible to each other. But the point about that things can be considered in separate categories, but one primarily, and the other second. This is why I think that's what I'd have to think about, because it seems to me then I still think it's right that exchange value only comes about because of something's use value. The reason you can use something in exchange is because other people want it. Whether it's a practical usage or enjoyment usage or whatever, you can exchange it because people can do something with it. So I'd have to think about it as being primarily like in itself in that category. And in some other ways you talk about it as quantitative. But again, that's just something I have to go through. But that's a helpful thing to think about. But
yeah, I mean, I think it helps. I mean, I think it clears up the problem, and it's a problem. Like,
well, if I can get through it right, if I can think through it properly, it might.
Here,